I wanted to show you a new training board that I've created. This has been a result of the last 15 years teaching basic electrical students at Weber State University. And I've tried to put things on this board that would be really good for a student to be familiar with when they first start learning about electrical. The board is pretty small. It's about 4 inches by 4 inches. And I'm using a 3-volt battery to power the whole thing. I wanted to make it compact but still usable in the classroom. On the back I've got some more information, and this QR code will go to lessons that talk about each of these individual sections. I wanted to create this video just to kind of introduce the board. I'll go in more detail for each of the individual sections, and we'll have practice things that students can perform. So the first area that I wanted to just highlight is over here. This is where you turn the board on. So it's just got this sliding switch right here. If I slide it in that direction, it turns on. I wanted to create a board that ran off of 5 volts, and so I'm using a 3-volt battery here, and then this circuitry is for stepping up. Students really don't need to interact with that part. I just have that there so we can be working with a 5-volt circuit. Up here at the top I have this simple circuit section, and if we turn that on with the switch, we can see that we're using a switch to turn on this LED. I've incorporated different test points, so you see these little silver points right here. These are places students can put their multimeter lead on and make measurements. They could make the measurements individually at each of the components, but I thought it would be a little bit easier for them to make those measurements. In the simple circuit, I tried to come up with ways to demonstrate or show the different schematic symbols that they might encounter. We look at LEDs and so on. So I'll have a more detailed video of this simple circuit. The next section down is series circuits. So here we can turn on this circuit, just slide that switch on as long as the master switch is in the on position. This circuit can allow students to start realizing the different types of loads that are in the circuit and how they behave, how they affect the current in the circuit, how they affect the voltage as we measure in different parts. And so I'll have a dedicated video just to talk about this series section. I thought it would be handy also to be able to talk about total resistance. In my classes, we go over the total resistance of a circuit. The benefit of doing that is when students are adding accessories to vehicles or wiring up a trailer, it's important for them to understand the relationship between resistance, voltage, and current. And so I've got this section that they can measure total resistance and see how those two add up. The next section down is this parallel circuits section, so we can slide that on. You can turn all these on at once. This circuit right here, we break up the branches of the circuit, and this allows students to be able to make measurements on individual branches, to do some comparisons between a parallel circuit and a series circuit. Over here I have total resistance measurements, and one of the formulas that you can use to calculate total resistance. This is a really important concept for students to understand, that in a parallel circuit, when I add additional loads to the circuit, it actually decreases the total resistance. So that's kind of a thing that might be a little tricky for them to understand at first. Down here at the bottom, I decided I had a little bit of extra space at the bottom. I wanted this to be also a tool that could be used to introduce a multimeter and making measurements with a multimeter. So we can measure voltage and current and resistance in these top circuits right here. And this allows us to start talking about the different units that students might encounter when measuring resistance or voltage. So here we have the milliohm signal, and then this is just, there's no unit on this, and then we move up to 1K and 10K and 10 megohm. So this gives you a chance to introduce the student. They can make these measurements directly on these pads, and they can make sure that they're taking into consideration the unit associated with the measurement. So we'll have individual videos about each of these components. On the back, I have these sections. These are just some things that I usually try to introduce to my students as they start their electrical journey. So here we have a section on relays, kind of the difference between a 4-pin relay and a 5-pin relay. This numbering sequence is very common in automotive circuits in the United States. In cars produced in the United States, they use this kind of weird numbering system, and it might be a good little reminder for students. Here we're looking at schematic symbols for switches. different kinds of switches that we might have. Over here I just highlight a couple different loads and the loads that students might encounter and the schematic symbols that they should be familiar with. Here we look at power and ground symbols and the different things that would be found that were related to power and ground. This middle section I dedicate to Ohm's law. I like to be able to help students understand how to make Ohm's law calculations. I think that's a critical thing for them to understand electrical theory. They need to know this relationship really well and how to make some calculations. If they know two things, how do they figure out the third? And I'll have another video that covers that. These are just some basic meter tips that I wanted to include right here. These are things that maybe just be a little reminder to students that when I'm measuring voltage, these are the things that I should take into consideration. Resistance, I want to make sure I powered off the circuit, and then current is going to be measuring in series. This QR code goes to my website, and I have some free training revolving just around this specific card. It'll allow students to be able to kind of work through, and instructors work through some lessons and make sure they understand all the different features of this card. And that's it. So I wanted to just introduce that to you. I'm going to start selling these on my website. So if you go to sbc-trainer.com. I'll put a link in the description. You can take a look at these. I'm going to try to sell them as inexpensive as I can, and hopefully it becomes a valuable tool that you could use in your automotive or electrical training classes.